IGN-game-scoop is brought to you by Watch Dogs, available May 27th.
Okay. Big question to discuss today. As we said, GameScoop is running for 8 years now. So I want to know, what do you guys think is the biggest thing to happen to video games in the past 8 years? Greg, let's start with you.
I'm going to say the rise of the independent developer. Thank you. One independent developer in the audience, everybody.
It's Greg Atlas.
No, I've been here 7 years, right? So when I got here, I remember the big talk at the time, the thing we talked about the most, it seemed like week in, week out, was this thing called Xbox Live Arcade, right? And what game had come to it, what is this, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And that was like our first taste of like, all of a sudden, we weren't waiting for just discs, right? We weren't waiting for the next big AAA release. And it was, it was just a drop of water out of the faucet, right? But then... Like
a steady stream of smaller games, is that what you mean?
I'm getting there. I'm saying at the beginning, it was just a drop. It's not like it is now, right? It was that drop. And then all of a sudden, when the iPhone hit, right, they turned on the faucet. And that's when there was like, all of a sudden, like right now, right, there are more games than we can possibly keep up with.
Yes.
Brian, you and I used to be able to play everything that came up.
Yeah, we would try to, right?
Yeah.
And talk about it the next day.
Exactly.
And now it's like, hey, Greg, did you play those games last night? No, there was 45,000 of them.
Yeah, exactly, right? There's too much released. And when iPhone hit and it was like, for $99, anybody can develop games and apps, a lot of people took to that and jumped on. And as they did that, Steam was already rising, obviously. There was all this stuff. But then they made it easier. And now you look to where we are today, right? PlayStation 4, all these different systems that are like, PlayStation 4 lifeblood, right? And Xbox One is trying to get in on that. And indies are now such a huge deal, but 8 years ago they for sure weren't.
Sure, 8 years ago, two guys working from home couldn't put a game onto, the Xbox 360 or the Wii.
Yeah, it wasn't possible. You would see stuff like Alien Hominid on the GameCube was like a huge deal, and you didn't get games like that anymore, and it cost $30 or $40. And now you see stuff like that come out for $5 or $10 on PS4 or Steam.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, I think maybe Braid was the first breakthrough one. That was the one it seemed like everyone was talking about, at least.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those XBLA games.
Right.
And I like that. I think it was fine for the time that XBLA really put an emphasis on like $10. These games are all going to be $10 or $15. But I'm glad that we've gotten beyond that. And on the PS4, I'm glad that games are just games.
Get it out of your system.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there can be there can be a free-to-play game on PS4 or $10 or $20, or you can get a $60. You can download. I downloaded Lego Marvel instead of buying it, and now there's that sort of barrier has been broken down where games can come in at any price point, and so every developer can do what makes sense for them.
Well, going back to how Damon is always ahead of his time, I mean, that was what I loved about On the Download, right? He did a show for IGN that was about the best downloadable games. Yeah. And then eventually Damon's like, well, everything's downloadable. Yeah. I'm not doing this anymore.
When we started, downloadable things were like their own thing.
It was quarterly.
Kind of unique.
Like this,
but now it's just...
They were less than even in a way, right? Or whatever.
The thing...
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the thing about indies is that they can go direct to consumer now. Like, that's really what changed it, is they didn't have to, how challenging is it to get a disc printed up and you need to have a publisher and you need to get it in Target, to make any money? It's impossible for a small team to do something like that, or almost impossible. And so you can't really underestimate, how important, strong digital distribution platforms were for something like that.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago we would say, it's a downloadable game. And that was almost like being it's crippled.
Or the review would be like, not bad for a downloadable game.
Yeah, not bad for a downloadable game. Yeah, she races good for a girl. It was like such a stupid thing to say. And now everything's kind of meshed together. And when you look on the storefronts for these games and these game consoles, you'll see something like Tomb Raider next to something like Limbo or something else.
Yeah, for sure. On Xbox, it's Peggle right next to the video games.
I love that.
PlayStation 4 is doing a huge push right now for Octodad, which is awesome.
Totally. And I love that we've gotten to that point, and then I think the audience has come with that, right? And they haven't, that stigma's been lost on them too. So a few years ago when we were like, Limbo's out, and it's probably the game of the month. We're like, but it doesn't have any colors in it. there's no sound effects.
Damon played the main character in Limbo.
I did all the mocap.
Yeah, it's a beautiful game. You can beat it in a few hours, and it didn't have online multiplayer, and it didn't have death matches and DLC and all this stuff like that. And you could just finish it, and you're like, that was awesome, and it really stuck with me. Oh, and it was made by a small group of people.
Yeah, it's totally viable because since it is $10, you're not upset when you're done with that experience in 3 hours. You play it once, and I'm probably not going to play Limbo again, but it was worth my time and money at the time, and it was just awesome. The reality of being able to distribute digitally is totally what made stuff like that possible.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this: do you think indie games replaced the mid-tier game.
Yeah.
You know, not that there used to be there were like AAA games that would be tentpole releases throughout the year, and then you get smaller stuff.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time, right? Like I was talking about that spectrum. Like now there's indies, then there were mid-tier stuff like your THQs, and then there was AAA.
THQs
and then
anymore.
that all fell out because finally it got to this part where the business model for video games was not sustainable for you to put out a game that is crap. Or mediocre. You know what I mean? Or not that
just
great.
Not going to sell 5 million copies.
Right, exactly.
It's not that different than movies, where like the high-end, high-budget films cost $250 million to make now, and there's fewer of them. And then you see, you know, people like Woody Allen can continue making, you know, whatever they want to make. You know, there's this independent film like Sundance movies.
Sure.
Yeah, I would definitely say that the middle has fallen out of the games industry.
I just think there's a broader in movies. There's like a broader spectrum of budgets. There's like big budgets, and then. You know, there's like your $200 million movies, but there's also $100 million and your $30 million.
Like, I don't know. I don't really feel like I see that many. Yeah, I mean, there totally could be. But I think the point about video games is totally well taken. Like, these companies that are in the middle, like a company like THQ, they got squeezed out by... I would say the indies, as they get more sophisticated and more complex, like, indie developers aren't just two dudes in a basement. Like, they could be a team of 20, you know, working on a game with a small budget. You know, you see companies like the people that did the Kickstarter. Who developed
the one guy? Right.
No, the Fallout New Vegas developer. Obsidian. Yeah, so they're doing their Planescape Torment like pseudo sequel, and that got funded for like $5 million. Like, that's totally indie. It counts as indie, but it's not the same as like, you know, a dude making a game and releasing it on the App Store.
Right.
Like, they've sort of replaced that middle ground, in my opinion.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, now it just seems like there's AAA games and then just indie games today, right? So like PlayStation 4 has 100 games coming out this year. But how many of them are big AAA releases, right?
Yeah,
it's like 100 indie games.
I mean, there just aren't as many big games anymore because there's this sort of like race to the top of the ceiling, right? And like it's we're looking for stuff to be more and more realistic and more like this is like, oh, you can run your fingers through the blades of grass and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And these guys are like, hey, it's Squaxle. You play as a square and you beat up circles, and it sold 4 million copies. And they're like, great, this is the game of the year. Like. I like that that's happening now. I like that artists and independent game designers and creative people can get together with a small group of passionate, like-minded guys and go, we're going to make something totally crazy and totally disruptive, and we're not trying to take away from like the Call of Duties. Like, that stuff will always exist, I think, in some way. But it's awesome that there's this new movement right now.
Yeah, it's awesome that people can make games that aren't for everybody. Most people aren't going to like this, but 10,000 people will, and that'll pay my salary, and that'll let me make the next game.
Well, it's exciting to see, I think, established creators going to different lengths to get their game out faster and get it to the people they want, right? Because there are concessions if your game is published by Sony or Microsoft, right? They come in and they're like, well, this is fine, but change this and do that. And
it's got to make money.
You see like David Jaffe or Ken Levine or these people who want to get back. Let's make a smaller game the way we want it, get it out quicker, and move on to another project.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't say the PlayStation 2 price drop to $99 was the biggest thing to happen.
It was probably the biggest thing for me at the time.
I don't know if you remember, you were pretty excited at the time. We have a clip actually here that we can link to.
What a great Greg way.
All right, so let me explain it to you again, all right? It needs to be a hat that's made out of money. The hat itself is going to be made out of cash money. How many times...
It just happened during me so many years. Just made it happen.
Let me call you back.
The f***ing car, man. Let's go. This is gonna be great. PlayStation 2, Oni, Smuggler's Run, Manituka, pop this shit. Go!
I don't get what the big deal is. The original Xbox has been $99 for like 5 years now. Yeah, I haven't even seen it on store shelves in a long time, so it must still be very popular.
Don't be scared. I'm too smooth, you never see me coming.
It amazes me that all 4 of us in that video haven't been snapped up by a Hollywood studio to go make a motion picture
yet. It's so weird to see you as a fat, loud guy.
I know. I've changed a lot in 8 years.
Crazy.
It's fun. I'm wearing a Superman shirt, throwing comic books. How quaint.
Remember how nervous Clements was driving his car? That he wanted him to stop.
He begged Ty Root not to make him drive quickly, and Ty's like, "You have to drive out of the parking lot quickly." And he's like, "What if I get in a car accident?"
Justin, what is the biggest thing to happen to video games in the past 8 years?
Man, 8 years is a long time. It's crazy. This makes me think about it. What was I doing in 2006? I was still in Iowa. I hadn't moved to San Francisco yet. In terms of the video game industry, I think it's this continuing shift of the balance of power in video games is definitely shifting towards the Western world. Japan used to be like, when I used to get my copy of EGM magazine, and it would be like, what like crazy new video games are coming out of Japan, or like when a Final Fantasy game came out, that was the biggest thing on planet Earth, all over the world. And there are commercials on, the evening television, and now like that's been replaced by, instead of Final Fantasy, we have The Witcher and Skyrim. Like Skyrim sold with like 15 million copies or something insane like that. The companies that are left, like Capcom, Konami, Namco, like, are they still as relevant and hot? Like, do people care about them as much? Like, I don't want to take anything away from like Tekken or Street Fighter. Like, those games are big deals, but
Yeah.
Like, I think about, do you remember the Capcom 5, those 5 GameCube games?
Yep.
Yeah.
Where it was like, it was going to save the GameCube, and Resident Evil, and PNO 3, and these other games.
It became the Capcom, like, 2.5.
Well, sure, like, half the games never even came out, but, like, everybody lost their minds when those games were announced. And, like, what if Capcom announced 5 Xbox One games today? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't even happen. Right? It blows my mind. It's so interesting you say
do they even have 5 games?
Yeah, like when we grew up, it was all Japan. Japan was this like this. And I remember when we at IGN a few years ago, there was this guy. He came in. He was like a contractor, and he was like fixing the lighting. And he's like, "Oh, do you guys know about that PlayStation 4?"
Right.
And we're like, "Yeah, it comes out in a few months. We're really excited." And he's like, "I bet Japan's had it for years." And we're like, "Nope. I think they got it after us."
Yeah, like 6 months after.
Yeah, 6 months after us. So it was kind of interesting to see that power shift that's happened.
I mean, it used to be that way, right? Like games would come out.
It was this mystical land where just video games came from.
Yeah, we were always
video games. Everything launched there first, and then came over here.
We were always like 4 Final Fantasies behind.
Yeah.
Like their Mario 2 had different characters in it, and we're like, what the hell is all this? Like,
So I think there's really 2 things that I attribute this to, and I don't necessarily have it all figured out. But when I thought about this, first of all, Japan seems unable or unwilling to release video games. Like they don't. In the time that BioWare released the entire Mass Effect trilogy, Square Enix has been working on Final Fantasy 15. Like they announced that game in 2006. And to be fair, it has changed. It wasn't Final Fantasy 15 at the time, yada yada. But like, there's other examples of that.
I mean, like the one Colin always brings up, right, is Last Guardian.
Sure.
It's been worked on the entire lifespan of the Uncharted and now Last of Us franchise. All of those games have come out in the time that Last Guardian's been being worked on.
Yeah. So like, I don't know what's going on over there. Like, there's less people buying consoles generally, so a lot of Japanese game developers have moved to mobile. Damon, you were telling me that TGS has seen a big shift.
It's basically a mobile game show now.
I remember when you came back from a TGS and we were like, "How was it playing?" You're like, "Everything was mobile." Like it was like nothing was happening. There was nothing for us to play.
I mean, you and I have been to TGS together before, right? It used to be like a Japanese E3. It used to be like console games.
Yeah, I think the one we went to was like the Last Gasp. That was when they had Peace Walker and they gave out that demo and we put it on IGN and all this stuff. But like that was like the last big thing I thought that came out of TGS.
That's part of why, in IGN, we wrote a news story where Sony said that part of the reason they delayed the PS4 in Japan was because there was no games from Japanese developers. It wasn't just that. They needed to allocate, consoles to other territories and yada yada, but that was a part of it. It's just like no one is releasing games for these next-gen consoles. They just don't have it together from a development standpoint. So from a business standpoint, a company like EA or Activision is super good at like annualizing games. Like, love or hate Assassin's Creed, like they hit this quality threshold. They're pretty good games. They release them every year without fail. Japan seems incapable of doing that. Like, a Capcom or Namcom or Konami.
Good old Namcom.
They just merged again while you guys were watching. We can't keep up.
So Bamcom.
So do you think it's like the inability, or do you think it's like the unwillingness to sort of keep serving this audience that they're maybe not really interested in? I mean, a lot of it is like big action games and big shooter games, and I don't really think that's really in line with what they want to do in Japan.
Well, that's what I mean. They're like retreating back into their like Japanese turtle shells, where like Japanese developers make games for Japanese people, even though the rest of the world is not. Like the rest of the world's buying Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty and FIFA.
Right.
Like,
but is there anything wrong with that?
No, there's nothing wrong with that.
The thing you talk about, right, is especially like on the Vita, right? How many Japanese games come out, and people like Atlas or NIS will continue to make these really hardcore JRPG niche games that you'd think like nobody will touch that with a 10-foot pole, but they put it out and they set their sales expectations at a set that like we'll turn a profit on this because we're not coming out like Tomb Raider, where Square was like, this thing's going to sell so many millions. It only sold how many millions? Failure. You know what I mean? Like, if you set a realistic expectation, you can succeed.
For sure. It's not like a value judgment of like, I love Disgaea along with Damon. Like, I love those games. I'm going to buy and play every single one. But in terms of like relevance in the industry, like overall, like who's impacting the world of video games and moving it forward, I definitely feel like they've ceded that leadership position. They don't seem very interested, and they just kind of want to keep doing what they've been doing, and now all the innovation happens. You know, the indie scene all happens over here too.
Interesting.
Japan did have games like Cave Story and stuff like that, but again, like that balance of power has sort of shifted.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a seismic shift. It had started in the PS2, Xbox,
even earlier,
Xbox era. First of all, you've got this Western-made console finally in the Xbox, and the best-selling games on PS2, like in the top 10, you've got GTA 3 and San Andreas and Vice City. And you've got God of War. So these are like Western-developed games that are some of the best-selling games. So it like started then, but then the past 8 years, last generation, it's just...
It's real fascinating, right? Because you figure all the Western developers that are changing things, doing crazy stuff now, grew up on Japanese games, right? And that's the thing, that they took it and went with it and ran with it, and this is what we have now. Which is what I always talk about now, that it's going to be so crazy in 25, 30 years from now, the people who grew up playing Titanfall and Uncharted or whatever.
It's going to be the South Americans that take over, the dudes in Eastern Europe.
Is that who I got to keep our eye on?
Yeah, exactly. That Brazilian game
developer. That contractor guy's going to be like, the PlayStation 12, I bet South America's had it for
So objectively, like they seem unable to release games at the same clip and quality as the Western world. Subjectively, just on from a game design standpoint, like I think about something like Metal Gear. Like Metal Gear Solid on the PS1 was a huge deal, and now like the story makes no sense and the cutscenes are 30 minutes long, and I just feel like they haven't kept up in the same way. But that's totally subjective. Like if someone still loves that style of game, like I get that.
All right, Brian.
Hi.
You're up to bat. Biggest thing to happen in video games in the past 8 years.
So I'm actually going to counter everything you just said.
Oh, crap!
Because I honestly think the biggest thing to happen in the last 8 years was Nintendo. And they're Japanese, right?
Yeah.
In 2006, Nintendo put out the Nintendo DS Lite, right? Which was like...
Yeah.
There was the DS, which some of us had, most of us hated.
Yeah.
And we're like, what is this ugly thing? It folded
DS
weird.
That is really ugly.
It looked
really
like one of those old computers from like the 90s or something like that. And then the DSi came out, and it shipped 93 million units worldwide. Had Nintendogs, New Super Mario Brothers, Brain Age, Mario Kart, Animal Crossing, Pokemon, Zelda games, all this stuff that was happening.
It invented the selfie.
It's true, yeah.
And the distorted lens.
And making beautiful women look worse. And turning them into cats. So it was a really interesting time to be a gamer, because we were looking at Nintendo that was kind of split in half. Yeah. And they were doing totally awesome stuff for people like everyone in this room, and then they were doing stuff for our moms. And and your mom would be like, I gotta play Brain Age every day, or I gotta pet this Nintendo dog.
My mom had a DS for exactly. She played Brain Age like she was that woman, that middle-aged woman. Yeah.
She's like, I gotta work on my brain. You're like, I gotta beat Mario. Like, what are you doing with my thing? Put it down. And that was kind of huge, and it sort of set them off in this weird direction. And that's what I love about Nintendo, is they've kind of always embodied that quirky Japanese-ness of being like, we're going to do crazy things, we're going to move the medium forward, and we're going to do whatever we want. And it's going to be polished, and it's going to be beautiful and wonderful. And, we're going to put out as many as we need to every year. Like, I think that Nintendo didn't really have a problem putting out, we were talking about before, it took these guys 5 years to make a game.
Sure. I wanted to point out that they're kind of the one exception.
Yeah.
Like, they seem to have it together.
They got their stuff together. So they can put out a Zelda every few years. They can put out Mario every few years. In 2006, also, the Nintendo Wii launched worldwide.
Never heard of it.
Yeah. 100 million units shipped. 100 million! That's crazy.
Yeah.
And again, they did the same thing. We were like, some of us were playing Galaxy, some of us were playing Twilight Princess and stuff like that, and others of us were playing Wii Sports or exercising. And Wii Sports was great, right? Like, it did this thing where, for the first time ever, you could make... There was this thing that it was a create a character mode that everybody understood.
Right.
And no one had that before. Every time you'd start like one of those THQ wrestling games. You'd be like, make a character. You'd be in there for like 2 hours, you'd stretching out the eyebrows and stuff like that. Nintendo got that down. All of a sudden, you and your mom, again, if she wasn't playing Brain Age, were bowling together. And it was totally insane. 2011, the Nintendo 3DS launched worldwide, which now we're sort of looking at the back end of things. Like, it gets a little different for them now, because now in 2012 the Wii U launched, which, you know, is a slight footnote. 6 million units sold worldwide for the Wii U. 46 million for the 3DS. 3DS, we got stuff like Pokemon, Mario Kart 7, Super Mario 3D Land, Monster Hunter, Animal Crossing, Ocarina of Time, Luigi's Mansion, A Link Between Worlds. They invented Street Pass.
Of course, in 1 week you get Mario Golf.
Mario Golf. They invented Street Pass, which is like, you were upset. We were like counting down the clock to start the show, and Greg's going through them on his 3DS. It's one of those things where you can't go to an event now without it being part of it.
Right.
And Nintendo's insanely Japanese, and they're insane. And little by little, they've just been sort of, in a good way.
Nintendo, insanely Japanese,
and insane. Little by little,
it's just Reggie with like Joker face paint.
He's got another head on the back of his head, like, oh. They've just gotten away with doing totally crazy, really fun things, and they kind of go by the beat of their own drum, and I appreciate that.
But where does that lead to? You know what I mean?
Say, like, it's crazy that since they're traded on like the stock market, it's so much like, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're the biggest video game console of all time.
Yeah.
But now your new one's not doing so hot, so you're
dead. It's over.
Exactly.
Just publish software.
See, and this is why it was tough for me to look back at the last 8 years, because like you said, like 8 years is like 8,000 years in some other industries, you know? Like the paper writing industry. I'm sure they're like, oh, paper's...
Paper writing?
Paper writing?
Yeah, you use paper, roll it into another paper, and then... but when we look at I didn't go to paper college, all right? When you look at the games industry and we look back, it's always like December every year we go, oh, let's look at the game of the year. Yep. It's so hard to remember stuff from January.
Right.
And just like when we look back at the last 8 years, it's really hard to think about stuff from 8 years ago, you know? But yeah, the Nintendo was on top with the Wii and the DS, and the 3DS was the best-selling system last year. And this year we're like, well, now what? What have you done for me recently, right? And it's kind of a problem, but I think that they've done enough and learned enough to come back on top someday.
Well, yeah, so like, what's your... You're saying Nintendo's the biggest thing to happen.
Just the word Nintendo.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I think just them as a company.
What's the biggest story in 8 years is Nintendo?
I would have to say the Wii, and bringing everybody in who hadn't played video games in decades and getting them to play video games again was probably the most important thing that could happen. Apple saw that and they go, oh man, we can do that? Boom, everybody came in. And they totally stole the thunder from that, you know? And I think that that's where you started seeing people playing Angry Birds on the train again. And like it was back when we were growing up, you would see a guy playing, like a businessman would play Tetris on an airplane. You're like, wow, he's got a Game Boy too. And he probably could own my dad, he's so rich.
Here's my question. Do we think the success of the Wii and so many third parties flooding it with crap leads to the middle falling out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one led to another. And we actually, like, the motion controls thing is a weird footnote. Because there was a few years where we were like, this is going to be the future. And then we were like, this sucks. And then we were like, I hope this is never the future. And then it was like, it isn't the future. And it all went away. And yeah, luckily it all went away. But I think they had to be there to try that and do that and move it in that direction.
Nintendo's been saying ever since my first E3 was 11 years ago, and that was the GameCube, and they said, you know, we don't see Microsoft and Sony as competitors.
Yep.
And everyone's like, oh, like Nintendo, you're so stupid, you know. But then with the Wii, that finally came true, and you're like, oh, I get it. Like, I understand now what they're talking about. They're totally doing their own thing. When you think about making Mii's, like, you think about a character creator. And, like, you're trying to, like, how big do you want their forehead ridge to be? And I'm like, I just can't, like, it doesn't make any sense. But then the Mii's so simple and accessible and fun, and then it totally does look like you. And that's, like, a perfect personification of, like, what Nintendo's been up to these days.
I think to this day, if you look at the Kinect, they're still sort of chasing that.
Yeah.
They're like, check out Kinect Sports Rivals. And we're like, no.
Yeah. I always thought that was like marketing, or that was like, you know, PR speak of like, we're not paying attention to what, you know, the Xbox is doing. But now, like, I kind of believe that that's the truth, and Nintendo genuinely is sort of trying to forge their own path. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think that's a good call.
Thanks.
The Nintendo's a huge story. All right, my submission for what might be the biggest thing to happen to video games in the past 8 years would be Xbox Live. And the socialization of video game consoles.
Sure.
So like before, you know, with my PlayStation, my Xbox, my GameCube, I turned it on. It was just me in my living room, all by myself, playing Resident Evil 4 or Disgaea for 300 hours. But now after Xbox Live, I turn on my PS4. I can see all my friends are online. I can see what they're doing. I can see what they're watching. I've got ads, suggesting I buy Doritos.
What you always wanted.
I know.
You take the good and the bad.
That part's a little weird, but just being able to it's not an isolated experience anymore.
Sure.
It's so easy to forget that before Xbox Live, like when Xbox Live was brand new and it's like every game has a demo and that was a huge deal and I downloaded demos for all these Xbox 360 launch games. And now it's just like become the standard. Like how quickly was it just like, no, this is just the way things are.
Do you remember the E3 when Microsoft was like, and check out our new demos on your Xbox today?
Yeah, you could just download
That was
them.
awesome.
You could download the E3
so
demos.
Cool. Yeah.
It's great.
And I know that every console has that service now, but the reason I say Xbox Live is because that was the first one, and I think Nintendo and Sony had to play catch up. It's just mind blowing to me that Xbox Live actually came to the first Xbox, but then they sort of really relaunched it with the Xbox 360. So Microsoft had this vision in mind; they were planning this all along for the 360. Sony put out the PlayStation 3 with no plan for a social network in mind. It's crazy.
They'll sort it out.
Yeah, they're like, wow, it's just like the PS2, but it's more powerful. Yeah. And you're like, what?
And it's really expensive.
The Xbox 360 does what?
And the store is basically a web page that barely works. Great, Sony.
Yeah.
It's like that's what was actually next gen. Like it wasn't necessarily the graphics or the
100%.
Blu-ray drive. It was those social connected internet
Being able to
features.
chat with each other while you play different games, seeing what people were doing, going and inviting, doing all these different, achievements, gamer scores, all the stuff.
Leaderboards. Like I wrote an op-ed for an older website that I used to work for that was about how Xbox Live brought back leaderboards, brought back that feeling in the arcade of like my family owned a restaurant and I would like try to set all the high scores in like Donkey Kong and stuff. And then I played Geometry Wars for hours and hours and hours trying to beat my friends. What made that so interesting was it's meaningless to me to be like, I used to be 20,000th in the world, and now I'm 18,000th. Right. But if that score was enough to like boost me ahead of my buddy, like that sort of contextual leaderboard was a huge deal. And
when you could sort by friend, it was over.
Yeah, exactly.
To see what somebody else, so you come to work and ask them how they did that. Like, wait a second, you're like 2 million ahead of me. What did you do different?
So it's like now I'm playing Trials Fusion right now, and it's the exact same deal. Where like, it's like okay, so I'm 1,000th on this course, and that's actually pretty good because like there's 100,000 plus people playing that game. But it's still not like that number doesn't mean anything to me except to know that if I were to pass you or Damon or someone like that, like that's super awesome.
Yeah.
Do you remember like growing up and someone would be like, "Oh man, he's the best Mario Kart player in the world," and it's like, "Well, no, he's not."
You mean
on our block?
On our block, which is basically the world.
Which is the world, and now you can just prove it and be like, "No, you're like 80th millionth. Like you're not. You're nothing." Which was sort of like, it's sort of terrifying, but I agree. The second they let you sort by friend, then it was like, okay, well, I'll never be the best in the world, but I can beat all of you guys.
It's the smartest thing they did.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's been a bigger generational shift for video game consoles. Because if you think of the NES, Super Nintendo, N64, it's all kind of the same, just getting like prettier and the games getting bigger, right? But like now, when I log, now I turn on my console and I can see what Greg's playing.
I play a lot of Steam games right now that I actually play more on PC than either of my next-gen consoles. And their integration of, like, I can see how many people on my Steam friends list own a game and how many of them play the game and how long they played a game. And I'm like, if there's a game I'm thinking about and I see 3 people I trust all, spent 40 hours with it, like, I don't need to, that's replaced sort of, I don't necessarily need to talk to them about it. Like, just that discovery of games is really helpful as well to be able to see what people are buying and playing and having access to all that. It's awesome.